Community members, I'd like us to welcome Jonathan Smith, who is the Commissioner for the Division of Human Rights. Commissioner Smith.
Thank you, Antoine, and thank you for having me this morning. As many of you know, Lieutenant Governor Kathy Hochul was supposed to join you this morning, and unfortunately, at the last minute, there was a death in her family, and so she's unable to be with you this morning. And I know that if there was any way that she could have been here, she would be here. And I know that she will, looks forward to being with all of you as soon as possible. And I know also that I am a poor substitute for the Lieutenant Governor. So I will do my best. But again, I do want to convey her sincerest apologies for her inability to join you this morning. I also want to thank Antoine for that introduction. It's really great to join everyone here at the In My Mind conference. Obviously, we are in the middle of a global pandemic that has completely upended so much about our lives. And unfortunately, we know that although COVID-19 does not discriminate, that certain communities, and particularly minority communities, older senior communities, have been disproportionately impacted by COVID and by this pandemic. We also know that, and Governor Cuomo often says this, that we are dealing with multiple pandemics. We are dealing with the health pandemic because of the coronavirus, but we're also dealing with a pandemic of racism and violence against communities of color, and particularly Black communities, and particularly Black trans women. And we know that that pandemic, unfortunately, is not receiving the attention that it deserves and the spotlight that is necessary to highlight all of the underlying problems that have led to this true crisis in our country and in our state. What I can say, and what does give me some degree of hope, is that at least here in New York, we have been on the forefront for trying to solve all of these pandemics and make sure that we live up to the promise of our country and of our state. New York has long been on the forefront of progressive movements. We have worked to change culture, to create healthier environments. We have been the epicenter for working towards equality and bold ideas. And while we always don't get it right, we are committed to a more just, a more fair, and a more equal society. When COVID hit, and it hit New York hard earlier this year, New York learned that we had to respond quickly, thoroughly, scientifically, and smartly. And when we found out, and when the governor found out that COVID was hitting communities of color, we took action. He directed the Department of Health to work with SUNY Albany and with Northwell to study the disparities dealing with COVID-19. And we looked to understand how and this disease was impacting and plaguing particularly African-American and Latino communities. We also know, and we knew that this wasn't just a physical disease, that COVID has also had a tremendous mental health aspect, causing stress, anxiety, and exacerbating many underlying mental illnesses. And we also know that this has had a disproportionate impact on the LGBTQ community. And that's why in the state, I'm proud that we set up New York Project Hope Emotional Support Hotline, which was a lifeline and a resource to people who needed it. We also set up a suicide prevention task force that promotes mental health awareness and access to resources for the LGBTQ community, and doing so in a way that is culturally competent and truly helpful to people who need it the most. We also know, unfortunately, that, well, I should back and say, one of the things that has been so tragic and so frustrating about the COVID-19 pandemic is that we've seen the federal government not only shirk its responsibilities, but really turn its back on the community all around the country that really needed it to be a resource, to be a partner, to provide real leadership. And unfortunately, this isn't the first time we've seen the federal government do this. The HIV and AIDS crisis is yet another tragic and painful example of what happens when the federal government turns its back on a community in the midst of the public health crisis. And we saw in that crisis what happens when a government fails to do its basic duty, which is to protect its people. And like I said, in New York, under Governor Cuomo's leadership and under Lieutenant Governor Hochul's leadership, we are working hard to make sure that no matter who you are, regardless of your gender identity, sexual orientation, race, we are working hard to pass and ensure inclusive policies to make sure that full equality under the law isn't just a saying, but it is applied in real time and for real people. Just this year, in the last year and a half alone, the governor signed the landmark Say Their Name reform agenda, which ushered in a wave of critical and long overdue criminal justice reforms. We legalized gestational surrogacy to make it clear that families of all types and shapes and makeups are protected under New York state law. And we passed, and this is something that's particularly salient for me as the commissioner of the Division of Human Rights, we passed the Gender Expression Non-Discrimination Act, GENDA, making clear, explicitly clear under the New York State human rights law that discrimination based on gender identity or gender expression has no place and no business in New York State. And of course, we were also the first large state to pass marriage equality, building on that legacy and that tradition of progressive development and progress in New York State. But we know that it's not just about passing laws or changing policies. It's about making sure that those changes are actually felt and experienced in real time by people, and that it translates from what's happening in Albany or in conference rooms into the homes, apartments, workplaces of people all around the state. And we are working as hard as ever to make sure that as we build back from these multiple pandemics, whether it's the pandemic of COVID or the pandemic of systemic racism, that we are working to build back better and more inclusive in every facet of life. And we are making clear that we will never tolerate any form of hate in our state. Because we are one family. We are the New York State family. And we know that when one person is suffering, we all suffer. And we know that when one person is discriminated against, we're all discriminated against. You know, I know that there's a lot more work that we have to do, that there are far too many New Yorkers who continue to suffer from discrimination, from hatred, from bigotry. Each day when I go to work at the division, I'm reminded just how terrible and how tremendous the consequences are when we allow and when we permit discrimination to spread and to exist in our society. But every day when I go to work, I'm also reminded that we are not powerless against this, that there is work that we can and that we must do to make sure that our society lives up to its promise. And so, as I said at the beginning, I know that times are tough right now. I know that watching the news or reading the newspaper is so depressing and so frustrating, and it can feel almost hopeless. But I want you to have hope, because New York continues to lead through these crises. New York continues to work to be a better place and a better and more just society. And through our partnership and our relationship with groups and individuals like you all, I know that our best days are ahead of us. And I know that we will have a society and a state that we are all worthy of. So thank you so much for having me this morning. Thank you for your partnership with the state of New York. And I really look forward to the rest of this conference.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Smith. It seems like somebody else was probably trying to, have a conversation with you.
No problem.
But thank you very much. More importantly, I think it's thanking you for stepping in at the last minute to do this, to assist us, to talk about what is going on at New York State level, and also to welcome you to your new role, because just last year, Commissioner Angela, now I imagine former Commissioner Angela Fernandez was one of our main speakers last year. So it seems like we're stuck with the the Commission of Division of Human Rights, but which is a good thing because then you guys get to represent our communities exactly as we should. And I'm really glad to hear about some of the things that you were saying that New York State has done, some initiatives that you've taken. Let me just see if there are any questions. One of the things that I had for Commissioner, for the Lieutenant Governor earlier on is a couple of different things that maybe you might be able to provide some questions on. So is there anything that you can tell us about progress towards decriminalizing sex work, especially that often plagues members of the LGBT community and many who are transgender of color?
Well, thank you, Antoine. And you mentioned Commissioner Fernandez, who I had the privilege of working with before I was commissioner. I worked in the governor's office and worked very closely with Commissioner Fernandez, and so I know how great she is, and what a loss her moving on is to the division. And once again, I'm a poor substitute in that regard as well. But as I mentioned, and I think you raise a really good point about, there's a range of issues in which we know that LGBTQ communities continue to suffer real challenges when it comes to issues around law enforcement and criminal justice. And this is an issue that I also, not only in my capacity at the Division of Human Rights, but in my former capacity in the governor's office, had the opportunity to speak with stakeholders all around the state about. I think that there's a range of issues. Certainly there's the issue of sex work and decriminalization, which you flagged. I know another big issue that I heard from a lot of people about, and I know the governor and others and the lieutenant governor have heard from, is around walking while trans, and that issue, which we know also has an impact on LGBTQ and particularly transgender communities. And I'm really, really proud that the governor, announced his support for repealing walking while trans, because I think that's an incredibly important step. I mean, obviously, the governor announcing his support is not the same thing as that law being repealed, but I think it's a really important step forward in that conversation. And it has, the fact that the governor has gone on record that that law does not need to exist and has real harms for LGBTQ and transgender communities is really important. I think on the issue of sex work, I mean, I think in many ways, what has happened over the last couple of months, not about the pandemic, but in the aftermath of George Floyd, we've seen a real conversation about criminal justice reform and about thinking through the laws that we have. Are they doing what they're meant to do? And are our law enforcement agencies and officers doing their job in the way that is respectful and helpful to the communities that they serve? And I know part of that process, some changes were made, repealing 50A, banning chokeholds, but that there's other work to be done. And there's actually a process going on throughout the state right now at the governor's direction, where communities are looking at their law enforcement systems, looking at these laws and thinking about, are there other changes that need to be made? And so, I fully expect that as we go into the next legislative session, and obviously this current session was very much disrupted by the COVID pandemic, but as we go into the next legislative session, there's going to be a lot of conversations about criminal justice reform. And I think issues around decriminalization of sex work are definitely going to be a part of that conversation as well.
Thank you very much for this, Commissioner Smith. Just to follow up on that, is not just the issue of decriminalization and sex work. We know that last year, a transgender Latina died in Rikers Island. So the issue is not just decriminalization, it is more about how are particularly LGBT people of color treated by the criminal justice system. I'm sorry that our friend Jared Trujillo, who is president of the Legal Aid Attorneys, is not on, because I'm sure he would have been advocating the same issues. That many transgender people of color who are caught up in the criminal justice system often interdicted disproportionately and then suffer extraordinarily at the hands of the police. Is there anything that you can say about what the state is doing as statewide to address this? Because it's not just New York City, it's happening.
No, I think it's right. And, I would say, just as a point of kind of personal privilege that, even before I joined the state, I spent my entire legal career working on issues of civil rights as a lawyer at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. I litigated against the NYPD stop and frisk practices as a member of Barack Obama's administration in the Department of Justice post-Ferguson, was a part of a range of conversations about criminal justice reform. And so I 100% agree with you that this isn't about one issue or one problem. It's about a system that's in need of review and analysis and repair. And I think we have to look at where there are challenges and where there are problems holistically, all across the spectrum. So from pre-detention all the way to release. And certainly a part of that needs to be what's happening to people in our state jails and prisons as well. And I know that there are a range of conversations happening with docs, in the governor's office, with my agency, at the Division of Human Rights, and many, many others, to think about what more can we do to make our system more just and more fair. And also, it's not even just about justice in a hypothetical, legal, abstract way. It's about the fact, as you painfully mentioned, that there are people who are having interactions with our criminal justice system and are dying because of that for no legitimate and proper reason. And that is unacceptable. And that's something that we need to look at. It's something that the state has looked at and the state is going to continue to look at, to think about, whether it's conversations around solitary confinement, whether it's conversations about police reform, whether it's conversations about the structure of our jails and prisons and the regulations and the protections that we have there. All of those are conversations that are happening. And in some ways, one thing that I think is particularly unfortunate is that, these were also conversations happening, before the pandemic happened, the COVID pandemic happened. And obviously, COVID-19 in many ways, derailed so many of these conversations. And I think, hopefully now that, knock on wood, the health aspect is under control, and prayerfully and hopefully it stays that way. I think we now have more time and space to continue some of these conversations, but I think you're right. I think that this is a conversation that needs to happen on every level of criminal justice, of the criminal justice system and criminal justice reform. And I know that, again, like I said, New York State's not perfect, and there's obviously more work that we need to do. But one thing I can genuinely say is that New York State, that our governor, that our lieutenant governor, that I know all of my colleagues in the administration, we are willing partners, and we want to do better, and we believe that we can do better in this system.
Thanks again. We're looking to see if there are any more questions coming in. Dr. Freeman, who is here with her students from Brooklyn Borough of Manhattan Community College, she's commenting that there must be a policy throughout the state where citizens are part of the review process at all policy departments, that there are still feeder zip codes and populations that are targeted by the NYPD. Do you have a comment to that specifically? Because I have a couple of other things I want to talk about.
Sure, I'll be very quick. Yes, I agree. And again, I mentioned that, and for those of you who are not aware, I really encourage you to become aware. Earlier this summer, the governor signed an executive order that requires just what that commenter was saying, that every municipality that has a law enforcement agency across the state is required by next April to do a review of their systems, of their policies, of their impacts on communities, and come up with recommendations and policy changes to address those concerns. And if municipalities don't do that, they risk losing their state funding for those law enforcement agencies. And so again, I think that Governor Cuomo was the first governor, I believe, to make such a sweeping reform in the aftermath of the George Floyd protests. And I think it's critically important, because if you don't have the right people at the table, if you don't have impacted communities talking with policymakers, talking with law enforcement, then you're not going to address and fix the problems. And so again, I think this is a really important step forward, and I really encourage all of you, no matter where you live, because this applies to every community across the state, to make sure that you know about that process and that you engage in that process, because that is another avenue to make your voice heard and to really think about how we go about reforming our law enforcement agencies.
And I think that's actually very important. And I want to jump back on another thing that I think happened early this year, early this year, when I think the governor signed the law about the law enforcement database, providing their records for public access. But do you know if there's anything in the works to ensure that they are establishing a database statewide for law enforcement, so that somebody can be fired from Suffolk County and go to Westchester County and perpetrate the same crimes? So is the state setting up a law enforcement database to track and capture problematic law enforcement officers?
So yeah, that issue of kind of bad cops going from one department to another department, is an issue that happens around the country. When I was at the Department of Justice, post Ferguson, I know we had a lot of conversations about that at the federal level. And if I recall correctly, the practice was called passing the trash, right? Where you would have these kind of bad cops, game the system and continue to kind of wreak havoc on communities. So I don't know where exact the status is on the database, and because I've now left the governor's office, I'm not as involved in some of those conversations as I was. But I would say that I know one of the challenges that exists, and I think this is part of what I think the governor's other executive order that I referenced is getting at, is that you just have so many different law enforcement agencies all across the country, but also relevant across the state. And they're all, it's not as uniform as a system as, I think many people expect. We're talking about hundreds, thousands of different departments. And so I think part of what we're doing is at least we're beginning to make sure that we're engaging with all those departments and figuring out, what they're doing well, and most importantly, what they're doing not well or what they need to be doing better. And so, I think that, the governor has made clear that, everything's on the table in terms of thinking about how we address these pandemics that we're confronting. And, we're not going to change everything overnight, but I do think, hearing what the concerns are and, if this is a particular concern that, that we need to think about having state level intervention for, I think that that's also something that's on the table to be discussed and considered.
Thank you very much again. And just to follow up on that is one of our senior members of our community and the former planning member, team member, conference planning team member from last year, Dr. Wilhelmina Ferry. Hello, Mina, welcome. She has asked the question, I always think that the unions are left out of the discussion on reform, although they may be most significant in the behavior of police. How do you respond to the unions? And when we take into consideration New York City, Pat Lynch, and the Sergeants Benevolent Association president, and when they have been making racist and promoting white supremacist comments publicly and privately, how are members of our community supposed to feel safe and welcome and that they're going to get fair treatment when the police unions, who control so much of the authority and the function of the police department, are themselves displaying white racist behavior?
I'm not going to comment about any specific statements from people, in part because I don't think this value is worthwhile to kind of dignify those responses. But I will say that yes, I think unions need to be a part of this conversation. And you certainly, under the executive order in terms of police reform, unions are a critical part of that process, and unions need to be a part of that, right? Because if we don't engage every part of the system, and unions are a very big part of that system, we can't think about how to make the system better. And I would say that obviously, and obviously, to be clear, New York is a union state. Unions are really important. Protecting the rights of workers is really important. And I don't want to, nothing I'm saying is denigrating that, but everyone has to come to the table in good faith and recognize that we have a system that's not working, a system that in many parts is just broken. And so the hope here is that, the unions will be a part of that process, because if we don't get that degree of buy-in and support and engagement, it becomes much harder. When I was, again, at the Department of Justice, then Attorney General Holder would say, we opened a number of investigations into Ferguson and Baltimore and Chicago. And, those investigations were really important and it brought meaningful changes. But also, he would always say that, we're not going to litigate ourselves out of this problem, that in order to get widespread systematic reform, we need to engage with all the stakeholders and we need to get them to recognize the problems, to buy into the problems, and buy into being part of the solution. And I think 100% unions also have to be a part of that conversation as well for this to be successful.
Good, thank you very much again. I'd like to just, I've got one of my colleagues from the statewide Multicultural Advisory Council at the OMH. She is preempting one of my questions, but she always does this to me. So welcome, Pascal. So she's asking the question, how will the president's executive order about banning training on race and gender for agencies that receive federal funding impact the training for law enforcement and other government agencies on structural racism? So this question, in a sense, undercuts a lot of the work that we're trying to do, and we're talking about racism in law enforcement, including departments of corrections and court officers and so forth. So can you tell us about this? Can you talk about this?
Sure. Again, as a former Department of Federal employee and official, I have a lot of thoughts about that executive order, none of which are probably appropriate or helpful for this conversation. But what I would say that is perhaps appropriate and helpful is that the good thing here is that that executive order, as troubling as it may be, pertains to federal agencies and federal training. It has nothing to do about what state, local agencies or training do. And the reality is, for most of law enforcement, we're dealing with state and local actors. You know, you talk about law enforcement, police officers. Yes, there's the FBI, but most police officers you deal with on a daily basis are not federal employees. They don't work for the federal government. They work for the state or for localities. You talk about prisons and jails. You know, most people who are incarcerated in state facilities, and so that the reality is that, like, most of the people who are going to have an impact on these issues in the state of New York are not impacted by that executive order from the president. And in New York, you know, we have, not only has the governor not signed an executive order like that, and you know, I don't want to speak for the governor, but I'm pretty sure he's not going to do that. But also in New York, we have actually gone the opposite way. And we are working both to make our human rights law, our anti-discrimination law stronger and more robust, but we're also working to make sure that we are engaging our workforce, our employees, the people we interact with, to make sure that they understand the role of racism and homophobia and transphobia and every other form of phobia out there, and that they work to combat that both within themselves and within their agency, because fundamentally it's the job of government to represent the people. And if you are acting out of bias or discrimination, then you can't do your job, and that's just unacceptable.
And I'm going to shift now from law enforcement. I feel like we are doing a different kind of debate as compared to last night, right? So do you, what do you think that can be done to allow Black and people of color organizations statewide to increase and provide more culturally sensitive and appropriate mental health services for Black and people of color? And the reason I ask that question is that we've seen that the Office of Mental Health is one of the key areas for mental health within New York State. And we see that even though the Office of Mental Health had to be pushed to provide some public-facing statements that seem to be the equivalent of oil on water for the Black and people of color communities, there is still a significant lacking in the Office of Mental Health providing clear, direct services, culturally sensitive services for Black and people of color. Take, for example, the issue of Daniel Perdue, who was killed in Rochester about a month ago, two months ago. Okay, he was taken by the police after a 911 call to a Rochester health facility, which happens to be an OMH facility. 2 hours later, he was discharged. Even though it was recognized he was dealing with a schizophrenic episode and he might have been under the influence of some substance. So there needs to be not just a review, but a complete reformation of how the OMH addresses mental health in Black and people of color communities. What can you, as Division of Human Rights or in the governor's office, what can be done to raise this and begin reformation or correction?
Well, you know, I obviously can't speak for the Office of Mental Health, you know, but what I can say is that, you know, I know Commissioner Sullivan, and I know that, as I mentioned before, that I know she and her team are equally as committed to making sure that we provide that they provide services, you know, to all New Yorkers who need them. And again, you know, I think that the reality is that the recent events, you know, both these multiple pandemics, both the COVID pandemic, as I mentioned, you know, has really underscored the need to have conversations about mental health. And, you know, again, I think, you know, when things like this happen, it's important to think about, you know, kind of what's the silver lining here. I think the silver lining is that, you know, it's really placed more attention on the challenges that, you know, many people are confronted with mental health, and also that those challenges are not equally distributed across the population. And I think the situation in Rochester, the situation around kind of law enforcement more generally is also another example of the real challenges that we're facing in our mental health system. And so again, I certainly will raise this point to my colleagues at OMH and to the commissioner there and make sure that they're aware. I mean, I just unfortunately, because I'm not in the weeds of that agency, I don't want to say something that's incorrect or inaccurate, but I do know what is certainly correct and accurate is that OMH is a partner on these issues, and that, again, I think we're all across all of state government trying to figure out how we can be better and build back better and result to what happened over the last several months.
Thank you again. So I have two more questions because this is becoming like worse than last night. It has come to my attention that I'm sure you might be aware of New York City Human Resources Administration HACA program for a lot of people who are HIV. And so one of the things that it's come to my attention is that HACA is requiring, as part of their recertification for financial assistance, that everyone apply for disability, whether they are disabled or not, which raises the question whether HIV as a chronic issue is considered a permanent disability. But knowing that the person may be denied for the disability, and even when the person is denied, the HACA requires, under quoting a New York regulation, that the person must appeal or else they will lose their cash assistance. Is there anything, and I know that you probably can't answer directly to this, but I'm raising this as an issue that it may be something that you may be able to represent at the state level to address that it seems that people are being forced to file for disability, then be denied, then to appeal the disability claim, or else they will lose their cash assistance, which at this time is what they depend on. Like, you know what I'm saying? They're not allowed to work because they only can have $2,000 in their bank account. But then cash assistance at what, $192 every 2 weeks? You know, why would they want to do that? So that's, do you want to jump in and make a comment on that before my final question?
Sure. I mean, you guys are trying to get me in trouble by asking me about all these other agencies, but
but you're human rights, so hey, you cover all.
No, but but all fair game. Yes, like obviously I can't speak for another agency, and certainly can't speak for a New York City agency. What I can say is that I know that just this week, the state, we have an interagency task force on HIV/AIDS, response prevention issues, and I know that a number of my colleagues were at that task force this week and talking with our colleagues at DOH and OMH and across the board. And this is something I will also bring to that group. And, if there are things that we at DHR or maybe my colleagues of the state can do to be responsive to this concern, that's something that we would look to. I certainly know the challenges that so many people are facing right now, particularly people who rely on a form of government assistance given the challenges of the pandemic. And so certainly, I know the urgency of that challenge. And like I said, I can't speak to that, but I definitely can take that back and see if we could get an answer or some insights about that.
Please, thank you very much. I have a question from a member of our community. Can we talk about the role of the HRC on housing discrimination for communities using housing vouchers, Section 8 HACA? This is a serious problem that affects the mental health of our LGBTQIA+ community.
Well, yes, so this is a question that I totally can answer because it's about, at least partially my agency. So I think that's right. And, I think a number of things to be said about that. Just last year, and I'm really proud of this, New York Governor Cuomo signed a law banning discrimination based on source of income. And so, previously that had been the law in New York City and some other places around the state, but there had not been statewide protections. And there's no federal statewide protections, federal protections for this. And so the fact that under New York state law, no matter where you are, a landlord cannot discriminate against you whether you have any type of voucher or government assistance is a tremendous change and step forward. And actually, at the Division of Human Rights, we're working in partnership with Homes and Community Renewal and a number of our state agencies to do actually about a year-long campaign educating people about source of income discrimination, what it is. And that education is both for tenants or people who are applying for housing, but also for landlords, for brokers, for anyone who's engaged in the process. Because what we saw, first, what we've seen is that even in places where source of income discrimination has been illegal for some time, like New York City, it's still a rampant problem. And then moreover, there are places in New York State that this is a relatively new protection. And so there's a lot of work we have to do to educate people about what the law is, and then to also enforce the law to make sure that, again, particularly given the crises we're facing as a state right now, the fact that anyone should feel housing insecurity because when they have a voucher and when they have or a legal entitlement to a place to live is unacceptable. And so again, I know we can, I can talk about this for hours, which is, you don't have the time for that, but I would really welcome the opportunity to engage with you and your colleagues about what we can do around that issue, because I think that is unacceptable. And the fact that we have this new tool in our arsenal to deal with this is something we need to figure out how to better deploy to confront the issues you're discussing.
And I'd like to take you up on that, because DBGM will be launching a series of discussion fora in the next several months. And I would like you to come on to talk about HIV, mental health, and housing for LGBT people of color communities. How does housing and HIV impact the combination of both housing and HIV, how they impact mental health for LGBT people of color? So just so at some point, we need to exchange information and get all that stuff out of the way. No. I have one, my final question is your office or the governor's office aware of Affinity Health plans in the Bronx being sold to Molina Healthcare, which is a California-based Medicaid company? And what does that mean for the people and the clients that Affinity Healthcare serves? Or is this just a money? Is this just a money transaction that leaves the clients and all the people who depend on Affinity, that is a managed healthcare plan through the state's Medicare system? Is this just a money thing between Affinity and Molina? So are you guys aware of this? And do you know what's going on?
So again, unfortunately, this is something that probably falls within the province of the Department of Health, either at the state or maybe at the city level. But again, this is something I don't unfortunately have any information about, but I will definitely flag this for my colleagues and get back to you about that.
Thank you, because I think a lot of people, especially in the Bronx, as I'm sure you're aware, that the Bronx has the highest health issues in the country, and they're disproportionately affected. So Affinity being sold to a California-based company, where does that leave the clients? Where does that leave their membership, who may be dependent on Medicaid through the state's managed healthcare system? So I really and truly do appreciate that.
And I would just say, our office, the Division of Human Rights, our headquarters are in the Bronx, and so certainly, I fully know and the challenges that community, at least that community faces in regards to what you're talking about and why this would be extremely important.
Good. So once again, thank you very much again, Commissioner Smith, for joining us. And I know it kind of seemed like I put you through like another version of last night's debate, right? In a previous life, I used to be a journalist, so it's all about the questions for me.
Also, I did, unlike last night, I had very little heads up for this. So, please forgive any bad answers. But and also,
Oh,
obviously, I really, I would have wished, I know she would have too, that the lieutenant governor could have joined you, but for that last minute emergency. And so, apologies about that. And thank you for, putting up with me for this time. I appreciate that.
good. Thank you very much again. Um, so let's all kind of show our appreciation for the commissioner, right? I think the thing that people do is wave like this, you know. All right. So thank you very much again, Commissioner Smith.